Linghu, the Rowdy Youth, number 3. When I was young in the border regions, I was used to running wild, riding Tartar horses bareback and shooting antelope. Now that I've grown old and no longer strong, I still lean on the gate to camp, counting the geese fly by. Okay, so we continue with poems by poets that we haven't encountered before. So Linghu is very similar to some of the figures we've talked about and very unusual among the typical run-of-the-mill Tang poets in that he was what every Tang poet wanted to be, or almost every Tang poet wanted to be, a very successful civil servant. Let's start with a very brief biography, therefore, of Linghu. So he's mostly known today, as I say, not as a poet, but actually as one of the ground councillors, and therefore one of the highest positions in the bureaucracy in the middle years of the Tang dynasty, let's say, in the 8s, 10s, 20s, 30s. And also as a patron of Li Shangjing, whom we've already encountered, and who is generally considered the best poet of the late Tang. So Linghu came from a good family background in the north of China. He passed the examinations pretty soon, and after that he was involved in a series of provincial posts. He became very soon associated with Li Fengji, and therefore with one of the big court factions that would riddle and slug it out during the middle years and late years of the Tang dynasty, the News and the Lis. He was a member of the New faction. And as I said, he served first under military commissioners, then went back to court, got some important positions, and governed some provinces, whether as prefect or military commissioner, but also reached the highest positions of the bureaucracy as a grand councillor, which was the head of the bureaucracy, along with others. And he was therefore mostly successful as a political figure, and he was honored after his death by being granted the posthumous title Wen, cultured literary, which was, like the greatest aspiration that any civil servant and any Tang poet would have aspired to. So, as I've said, he had, a very impressive cursus honorum. His reputation as a poet is much, much below this, but he is included as such in the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati, with an entry written by William Nienhauser and Chen Wu. So, we shall be commenting on his literary prowess as well. Even as a writer, his greatest reputation is devoted to his memorials. Like, Tang civil servants were expected to write literary embellished court documents, usually using a style that was already slightly old-fashioned by the Tang, which was parallel prose, pian ti wen. And it seems that Linghu excelled at doing this pretty well. His poetry is particularly appreciated for its quatrains and traditional juefu. You will remember that juefu were basically ballads that had started to be collected and produced probably in the late Han Dynasty, which was 500 years before the Tang, and they continued to be produced in the years thereafter, especially in the period of disunion, although they became co-opted into the type of literature that the scholar officials also liked making, and given aspects of the traditional values and subject matter of scholarly official poetry. So as said, Linghu is mainly known for his quatrains and traditional juefu poems, often choosing to write about women in the palace or soldiers in the northern frontier. The group of poems that he composed under the title Shaonian Xing, the Rowdy Youth, are 3 poems that are precisely in this latter format. They are 3 poems about in the persona of a young soldier who has been sent to the northwestern frontier to fight for the empire. And Shaonian Xing, the Rowdy Youth, is a very typical, very traditional juefu title about poems and poets like to imitate this traditional style. And these three poems are pretty conventional, but they have some interesting aspects, especially the third one, which is the one we have read. The poem is a heptasyllabic quatrain, so it's not very long, with a clear caesura between the first couplet and the second couplet. Topic of the poem, as we said, is the life in the frontier of a soldier. In fact, it's a very small poem, but it depicts both the enthusiasm of the young soldier when he got to the frontier and the melancholy disposition of his old age. Remember, Tang military poetry, for the most part, like traditional Chinese poetry about war, is ambivalent or even starkly negative on the topic of war. There is very little of the epic touch, and most of the time, poems about the frontier are about the melancholy elegies at people having to spend long years fighting in the borders and dying unburied, far away from their homeland. Although you also get some elements in the tradition, especially in that inspired of the ballads of these young, youthful, enthusiastic soldiers who are really eager to serve the empire and achieve glory in the frontier. So the topic of this poem is life at the frontier. More specifically, it includes also an element of the passage of time, a contrast between youthful enthusiasm and old age melancholy. And I would say that's the topic of the poem. The most interesting aspect of it, it's pretty conventional, but it has some interesting use of imagery and wording that is worth commenting. So let's go to it. First couplet. When I was young in the border regions, I was used to running wild, riding Tartar horses bareback and shooting antelope. The first couplet denotes the youth years of the poetic persona. He was, a young and daring military officer, running wild and engaging in successful raids against the enemy, stealing their horses, hunting. So the stereotypical young bravo, successful at being a good soldier. Interesting, the running wild image. Fan Kuang in Chinese, running wild or going crazy, was a favorite expression of the great poet Bai Zhuji, but used exclusively when Bai had been drinking. Here, the drunkenness or this running wild is not based on alcohol, but it's based on daring, on stealing enemy horses, riding them saddleless. The antelope that is mentioned is also a word that seems to be pretty unique to Tang verse, referring here to the Mongolian antelope, Procapra guturosa. So this first couplet, shows us this youthful revelry on the frontier. The second couplet, as is pretty typical in a quatrain, changes the tone, and the second one makes also a jump in time. So the poetic persona is now an old soldier, probably unable to do these daring raids of his youth, still living at the frontiers, close to the gate of the camp. But he's looking at the geese fly by, and we remember that geese flying by are a stereotypical symbol of autumn, of separation, of sadness at separation from loved ones. In military style poetry, it also connotes this idea of being in barbaric lands in exile and wishing to fly away with the birds back to one's home and family. So now the poet is feeling sad, is feeling melancholy. He watches the geese flying south to the Chinese homeland, and he probably wishes he could return home, or at least has this melancholy longing for the home from which he has been away for many, many decades and years. So this is the poem. Not much to comment on it. It's a pretty conventional piece of frontier poetry, but as I said, it's interesting both because of the background of its author and because of some innovative, perhaps you could say, uses of imagery or wording.